So, continuing on with our looking at elves and fairy lore in the ballad series. Last time we had done the Elfin Knight. So this time I wanted to follow that up with something that's similar, but has a very different kind of ending. This is a shorter piece, so this will probably be a shorter video. And this is Lady Isabel and the Elfin Knight. And again, you can find various versions of this sung. Search on YouTube, you'll find it. I think Still I Span has a good version of it. And I do recommend that everyone try to find it being performed because that is how it was originally intended to be done. I will read a version of it, but that is not quite the same as hearing it performed, sung with music, or even just sung a cappella, because you kind of lose a little bit when you're just hearing it read. It comes off more like prose and not the way it's intended. So, that all said, we'll jump right in with Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight. And once again, I'm reading from my book, The New Dictionary of Fairies. This is a version from Child's Collected Ballads. I have updated language. As I've mentioned in previous videos, many of these ballads are preserved in the original language, which is often Scots, which is wonderful, but a lot of English speakers don't understand it and sometimes misinterpret or misunderstand different terms. So I do use an updated modern English version because I feel like that's easier for people, and I want to make sure people are comprehending what is meant to be the intended meaning of the words. So, Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight. And this is really a ballad about the consequences of wishing for this sort of thing. And again, we'll get into the discussion of it more afterwards, but just keep in mind this can be fairly directly compared to the one we did in the last video about the Elfin Knight. So, Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight. Fair Lady Isabel sits in her bower sewing. Yes, as the daisies grow gay, there she heard an elf knight blowing his horn, the first morning in May. If I had yonder horn that I hear blowing, and yonder elf knight to sleep in my bosom. This maiden had scarcely these words spoken, till in at her window the elf knight has leapt. It's a very strange matter, fair maiden, said he. I cannot blow my horn, but you call on me. But will you go to yonder greenwood's edge? If you cannot go, I will cause you to ride. He leapt on a horse, and she on another, and they rode on to the greenwood together. Light down, Lady Isabel, said he. We are come to the place where you are to die. Have mercy, kind sir, on me, till once my dear father and mother I see. 7 kings' daughters here have I slain, and you shall be the 8th of them. Oh, sit down a while, lay your head on my knee, that we may have some rest before that I die. She stroked him so fast, the nearer he did creep. With a small charm she lulled him fast asleep. With his own sword belt so fast she bound him. With his own dagger so grievously she struck him. If 7 kings' daughters here you have slain, lie you here, a husband to them all. So that's Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight. As you can see, very different tone from what we did last time, but very similar themes. So in the Elfin Knight, which was the last video, it begins with a young woman or a girl who, on the 1st of May, hears an elf knight blowing his horn and wishes for him either to be her lover or to be her husband. He then appears, and they end up engaging in this back and forth, basically riddle contest discussion, sort of negotiating the terms, if you will. In this one, it's a little bit different. So we have the same basic setup. We see Lady Isabel, who is in her bower sewing, which is an activity that would have been common for like ladies of the nobility to be doing historically. And she hears an elf knight blowing his horn. This again is happening on May 1st. It's a holiday called Bealtaine in Ireland, Beltane, other places, the 1st of May, has a very, very long and well-established connection to the good folk, to the fairies, to elves, and particularly to this idea that they are more active and more abundantly out there and more easily contacted at this time. Much like Samhain, November 1st, it's sort of seen as this transitional time with the seasons, which also involves this increased activity among the otherworld. So it's May 1st. She hears this Elfin Knight blowing his horn, and the implication there is that this in itself, like being able to hear this, would be unusual and probably is connected to the time of year, to the fact that it is May 1st. She hears it, she makes this wish, which again, we see the exact same thing happening in the other ballad. And as with the other ballad, as soon as she makes the wish, the Elfin Knight appears. In this case, he jumps in through the window into her bower. But this is where things take a sharp turn from what we see in the other ballad. In this one, he pretty much immediately, in response to her wish that he appear and that she sort of have him as a lover, he sort of immediately is like, we are out of here. Are you going to go with me willingly, or am I going to take you by force? And it's unclear because the ballad is fairly short and it doesn't give us a lot of backstory, a lot of information on what's happening here. It's unclear whether, in fact, she does go willingly or whether he does compel her either with, sort of physical violence or with magic. But he, in any event, does compel her one way or another. And so she goes with him. And the two of them go off to the Greenwood's edge, as it's described. The Greenwood, of course, is another reference to wider fairy lore. Fairies are strongly associated with the color green more generally, and the concept of the Greenwoods, the fairy woods, we find that all over folklore. So this would be something that people hearing it would understand is a reference to he's taking her to his own place. He's taking her to the land of the fairies, potentially to the other world in some sense. However, before they get there, they arrive at this location, and he pretty much tells her up front that he is going to kill her, that he has killed 7 other, he refers to them as king's daughters. We can sort of more loosely read that as like nobility, noble women, in that same location, and that she is going to be number 8. Now, Lady Isabel is a very interesting character because she initially does sort of plead with him not to do this, asks to be able to see her father and mother again. And he, of course, is like, no, I'm going to kill you. But then she sort of turns this around. And again, it's unclear because the ballad doesn't give us a lot of detail on what exactly is happening, whether she uses magic herself or whether she just uses her natural abilities, I guess we would say. But in any event, she lulls him to sleep. And the sort of implication is that she gets him, before he kills her, she gets him to lay down and is sort of stroking his hair, is sort of the implication. Again, you have to read a little bit between the lines with what we have to work with in the ballad. And he falls asleep. And again, you can read into it that she uses magic to accomplish this, which would not be unheard of in the ballad material from this period. Or you can just sort of read into it that she just lulls him to sleep. And he falls asleep. She then, and this is particularly interesting to me, so I want to note this for people following the video. She then ties him up with his own belt and then kills him with his own dagger. And I think it's significant here that she's using his own items against him. I would assume that she could have tied him up with something of hers, just based on the way ladies would have dressed at the time. She should have had something that she could have used to, bind his hands or what have you. But she doesn't do that. She chooses what would seem to be the more dangerous route, really. Instead of taking off something of her own, she takes off his belt, apparently without waking him up, which again is why you might sort of read some magic on her end into this and getting him to fall asleep. But takes off his belt and ties him up with his own belt. And I think the implication there, and again, this is reading between the lines, it's not clearly stated, but the implication here, I think, is that he could only be bound with something of his own nature, something that was also from the world of fairy, something that sort of might inherently have some kind of power to it, as opposed to like a mortal, necklace or belt or what have you. And that is something we do see in other stories and other folk tales and other anecdotal accounts, things like that. This idea that the beings of fairy oftentimes will have a certain amount of immunity to human world items, but not to things from their own world. So I think that it's significant here that she's doing this using his own belt. And then again, like there's no implication that she as a lady might necessarily have her own weapon, even her own dagger. But I do think it's significant that she kills him with his own dagger. And by implication, the dagger that he has used to kill these other 7 human noblewomen. So I think we're kind of looking at a situation here where it's heavily implied, at least in the ballad, that he had to be bound with his own belt, his own something, and that he really could only be killed, or most effectively killed, with his own weapon. And again, this is something we would sort of see at least implied in other material, this idea that the beings of fairy, the elves, have this degree of imperviousness to human-made things. Not iron weapons, that would be a whole different conversation, but more generally to human-made items, as opposed to things from their own world, which have a little more power over them. This is why you'll see in a lot of different, particularly quest-type stories, where a person has to go and retrieve something that is itself sort of a relic of the land of fairy, or has to go and get another being a fairy to help them by giving them something in order to contest with or battle against, whoever the fairy villain in the story is. So I think we're kind of leaning into those concepts here. This idea that she had to use his own belt, she had to use his own dagger. She does, of course, kill him. They don't say specifically how, except that she uses his dagger to do it. So you can sort of use your imagination there. And that her final words are sort of, if you have killed 7 king's daughters here, then you can remain here and be a husband to them all. So, it's sort of her flipping the script a bit. It's also, of course, important to note, so I'm sure anyone who's been following this series or any of my videos on fairy lore so far would already be aware, the number 7 is extremely significant when it comes to fairies. It's a number we see repeated very often. It's a number that often is repeated in very significant circumstances. I had done the earlier video about the tithe to hell, sort of where that plays a role in folklore, particularly the Scottish folklore, particularly lowland Scottish folklore, which is where a lot of these ballads come from as well. And in that, we see this idea of every 7 years would be when the fairies would pay this tithe to hell. There's also, of course, in Thomas the Rhymer, which is a ballad we've already discussed, this idea that he was with the Queen of Fairy for 7 years. 7 years was a traditional term of service, and particularly of apprenticeship. So 7 is really significant. It shows up a lot in fairy material. And so to see it here is very unsurprising, first of all, but also sort of significant. As soon as he told her, I've already killed 7 king's daughters, it's sort of a hint, I think, to people perceiving the ballad in any sense, listening to it, reading it, what have you, that something is about to be different here. Because if he does kill her, she'll be the 8th one that she's killed. And that actually doesn't fit with fairy material. But the idea that he kills 7 and that he himself is killed, that makes sense, and that is very significant and kind of fits in with all these wider patterns that we see. So this ballad in general, to kind of wrap up, I realize it's a shorter one. It does have a lot of significant fairy material in it. We've touched on that. It's happening on May 1st. We again see this idea of a young woman hearing this fairy horn and then wishing for this fairy to be her lover. In the other case, we saw that that went very differently. In this case, we still see that the elf is compelled to respond. He leaps in the window. It does not seem like he has a choice in this. She hears the horn. She wishes for him. He responds. However, whereas in the first ballad, the Elfin Knight, it seemed that the Elfin Knight could not just say no. He could not refuse. In this case, we kind of see the same thing in that he is compelled to respond. He can't seem to refuse her. And he never refuses her wish. He never says, I won't be your lover or be your husband, or do you want? However, instead of responding with these, riddles and saying you need to do these things before I will give you what you want, his response is, I'm just going to kill you. I'm going to compel you to come with me, and then I'm going to kill you, which is another way to get out of the situation for him that does not, I guess, involve the back and forth that we see in the other ballad. But there is still sort of that implication that he couldn't just refuse. He couldn't just not respond when she wished for him. And he couldn't just tell her no. His option seems to be, when this happens, then I will take you with me because you were wishing for me as your lover or husband or what have you. But when you come with me, I'm going to take you to this particular place. It's never said or even really implied they may have had sex, although you can read that into it in the way it goes then with him being lulled to sleep. I leave that up to the reader, but whichever direction that goes in, he brings her with him and then, is like, well, now I'm going to kill you, because nothing in what she wished for implied her safety in any way. And so he was compelled to respond, and he was compelled to give her what he wanted in some sense, but he was not in any way compelled not to harm her. So definitely very different in a lot of ways from the first one. A lot of fairy ballad material in here, a lot of fairy lore material in here. Definitely some things to contemplate and think about. Also, I think it's worth noting that this does sort of flip the script a little bit on the idea that the humans in these circumstances are the ones who really have control and have the power. Even though there's clearly some aspects where the elves or the fairy has to do certain things, has to respond in certain ways. The human is clearly not the one who's primarily in control. Of course, Lady Isabel does kill him, so ultimately she is the one that's in control in this particular story, this particular ballad. But some good food for thought here. Definitely some more insight, deeper insight into the fairy ballads. And I particularly wanted to discuss this one because this is one that is not as often discussed. People tend to sort of gloss over it, whether that's because it's shorter, whether that's because it's a bit grim. There will be some content warnings in the description for this video. Either way, it is not by far as popular as Tamlin or Thomas the Rhymer, or even the Elfin Knight, which of course then became Scarborough Fair. This is one of the more obscure ones in modern terms, but it does have a lot of good material in it. So, leaving you with a lot to think about. And next time we will continue on, dive into another ballad, and sort of take a look at what that one can tell us about all of this and all of these beliefs and fairies in general. So, have a great day, and I will catch up to you in my next video.